Gabriela Bašić Hanžek from the University of Split, with a presentation called Normativity, Logic, and Communication in Žarnić Philosophy of Law. So, Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriela, and today I will have a talk on the normativity, logic, and communication in Žarnić Philosophy of Law. So, first of all, let me express my joy to finally attend the live conference after months of Zoom meetings, at least for me. And I'm particularly glad that it turned out to be here at the University Center in Dubrovnik, where I used to attend, even as an undergraduate student, several very fruitful academic courses and workshops. So I'm really glad to be here. On the other hand, let me also express my sorrow for the sad occasion of losing your fellow researcher and professor of mine, Žarnić, in whose honor this panel is being held. So it's been already 4 years since his untimely death, but I believe that this event is not an end, that his loss is not an end, but that it's a beginning of some future meetings. So I believe that my task here at the second Italian-Slavic legal theory and philosophy seminar is primarily to honor Professor Žarnić's contribution to philosophy of law. So in order to do that properly, next to presenting his ideas in my talk, it seemed very important to me to participate in person, even though these unusual circumstances are in place, because Professor Žarnić had held a real passion for academic touring. He was really fond of conferences, and I believe that even those, sometimes even myself included, who haven't shared this passion, have grown to like it now. So I would sincerely like to thank the organizing committee, and especially Mario Krešić, for his help with dealing with practicalities and everything. So as I already stressed and admitted in my handout, which was received before, the title of my talk is rather honorary. And so is my presence here today. So because my current research area is by no means legal theory or philosophy and law, and that's why to participate in this conference for me is really challenging. So thank you for the challenge. So in all fairness, to assert that philosophy of law was the central topic in Professor Žarnić's research would also be an overstretching of the term. It wasn't. It wasn't a central topic, but it was a recurring theme, and I will therefore try today to do my best to put toward the main features of his work. Okay, so additionally, if I manage to use my time well, I will try to underline some more general views he held in logic and philosophy, and where and when it will be possible to do it. I will try to connect these general views with this specialized area of his research. Of course, I will try my best not to enforce systematicity in his views where it is not present, and also not to enforce views at all on topics he didn't address because he doesn't have a systematic philosophy of law, or if he did address some topics, he didn't provide answers. So I apologize in advance for not being purposely original or provocative during my talk. I may do it by accident, and I hope these accidents will happen. But being the first speaker and late professor's former teaching assistant, I deliberately choose to outline and to reconstruct his views as my primary goals. However, I do hope that all of this will show to be useful to incite a discussion on substantial issues, especially after talks of other participants, since of course, nor do I, nor do you share all the disease like Professor had. So let me conclude this introductory part of my talk with the methodological remark. So as I stated in my handout, I will try to avoid at all costs the use of symbolic notation. I am perfectly well aware that not all of us are formal logicians, and that sometimes symbols tend to confuse and to repulse the audience, even philosophers, let alone others. instead to attract and to elucidate. So I appreciate a similar remark which Professor Ratti made in his paper, quoting Professor Žarnić's thoughts on this issue. So my use of symbols will be very, very limited. So let us begin with some quite general remarks concerning Professor Žarnić's philosophical investigations. A more or less complete list of his work can be found on his Google Scholar and Crosby profile, and they contain many full texts which are available. Luckily, late professor's personal webpage is accessible again, thanks to our faculty's IT service, because temporarily it was down due to the change of server, and we also suffered an attack on our faculty's webpage, but now I think everything is under control. So if there are some papers or talks by Professor Žarnić which I would like to have, but haven't had the chance or didn't manage to find them on Crosby or I don't know where, I suggest you visit his personal page if you haven't done it already. So if we were to identify key historical philosophical figures and ideas which have made an impact on lay professors on philosophy.
Can you remove this video?
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we were to trace some key figures and ideas, we will find that there are several which have made the most impact, with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz being probably the most dominant of them. Leibniz's ideas of characteristica universalis and calculus of thoughts, calculus ratiocinator, which would provide humanity with a universal science, have remained a life-lasting inspiration for Professor Žarnić. And almost every item of teaching material he produced, and he produced many, and he taught anything from philosophy of education at the Department for Teacher Studies to introductory and advanced classes in logic at our university. So almost all of these materials somehow and somewhere contain a reference to Leibniz. So definitely that is the most dominant figure, and these ideas have really shaped his thought. Other notable figures and ideas which have made an influence include Carl Ivan Popper with his ideas of open society, fallibilism, and critical scrutiny. Professor Žarnić made quite an impact in philosophy of education, and he constructed a research site for education, Otvoreno znanje, open knowledge, which is an echo of Popper's ideas of open society. Then there's Jürgen Habermas with his threefold ontology of the world, of the objective, subjective, and the intersubjective, and especially the idea of non-hierarchical communication, which was extremely appreciated by Professor Žarnić. He was also under influence of Donald Davidson's investigation of language and interpretation, and then there's of course Jörg von Richt's investigation in the ontologic. Among more contemporary authors, he was predominantly influenced by Luca van Bentem, who expressed his condolences to me after Professor Žarnić's death, and the second European Conference on Argumentation in Fribourg in 2017, where I had the honor to meet Professor van Bentem. So next to Professor Žarnić's early texts on education, many of them which are written in terms one would regularly find in philosophy of science, but rarely in educational ones, and next to his work in dynamic semantics, within which he delivered his PhD thesis, there is an underlying common concern which can be traced in all of his work, especially in its later stages, during which I had the chance to work alongside him. He was chiefly concerned, with normative aspects of communication in general, and also specific types of communication, and of course, relation of all of this to logic. His general position on relationship between language, normativity, and logic can be best illustrated, I believe, by this quote from a 2012 paper, Norms of Logic in Language Use. This paper is part of Professor's rich work in imperatives across area between philosophy of language and logic, in which he produced several papers. So in this discussion of dependency between consciousness, intentional states, and social character of communication, he takes what he labeled the third stance or logic projection hypothesis. It's third stance because it contrasts itself to illocutionary logic and normative pragmatics. So according to this stance, quote, the logic of utterances is the origin of all other logics used in describing psychological and social realities. The logic of utterances manifests itself in its meaning effects, such as deontic or bulletic. It can be studied only in relation to deontic logic and logic of intentionality. Therefore, research in the logic of imperative and other utterances must include investigation of relations between logics. End quote. So you already saw this quote in my handout, and you see here it again for a good reason. The reason is good because this is not a particular highly specialized view Professor Žarnić held on some issue in philosophy of imperatives, if there is such a thing. So it's a general point of departure based on his previous work to investigate different normative systems and their respective logics. So I already stated this in my handout that this position is not only maintained as a declarative thesis, but is elaborated and carried out in his further work on imperatives, argumentation, and last but not least, philosophy of law. So in order to understand and evaluate Professor Žarnić's contribution to philosophy of law, I will here continue the suggestion I made in the handout that the best way to appreciate it is to follow two lines of study in his papers and talks. The first being the general study of normative systems with his papers from 2010 as seminal works on this topic, and the second line being the specialized study of legal topics, which was inspired by Stephen Kanger's account of rights, and of course Georg von Wrieg's later works in deontic logic. It's interesting that this second line chronologically precedes the first, more general one, but it comprises only papers written in Croatian, so probably majority of you haven't read it. These two lines of Professor Žarnić's work in philosophy of law are concluded in his papers starting from 2014, which was co-authored by myself, and papers from 2015 and 16, both authored on his own, and which are probably most known to majority of you. All of these papers share the same methodology Professor Žarnić devised in his previous ones. So he takes the agent-based perspective, which I believe is a clear echo of his study under Johann von Bechten, who was the first to introduce the notions of zero agent, one agent, and social character of logical notions. And there's the highly formal apparatus, set theory, etc., to deal with problems concerning desirable properties of normative systems, such as consistency, closure, etc. So this apparatus consists in devising new meta-language to interpret axioms of standard deontic logic as second-order theory in von Wrieg's footsteps, which of course means that Professor Žarnić adopted a highly pragmatic perspective of logic. He saw it as a study of conditions which bind rational agents in non-related activities. And the hallmark of this meta-language is its translation functions from deontic logic to set theory, similar to other accounts which were developed in set theoretic terms, such as those by Anschauer and Ligin, and of course by Jean Brou. So in the following sections of my talk, I will present a short overview of each of these lines of his study. I won't be able to go into much detail and fully present each paper on its own, so I will rather outline some general ideas and put forward main results. Professor Žarnić's earliest work concerning philosophy of law is a paper in Croatian from 2005, Pravo na obrazovanje I Kangerova teorija prava, Rights to Education and Kanger's Theory of Rights. This paper embeds Kanger's account of rights in an educational setting. What he discusses here is how to best translate the right to free education, as it is stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the typology of rights and counter-rights, which was developed by Kanger. However, the majority of the article doesn't deal with education, but it is rather an exposition of Wesley Hofeld and Kanger's own accounts of rights. Particularly, he emphasizes Kanger's distinction between seeing to be the case that by and refraining from seem to be the case at 5, as it's stated as an important distinction, where, of course, refraining from action is also considered an action. What is interesting here that he somehow rejects the problem of conflicting norms on the basis of prescriptive, not descriptive character of legal sentences, and shifts it shifts the problem of conflicting norms to its conditional version. And since conditional statements are not descriptive of a particular state, but are prescriptive, it's not really a problem if you have such sentences. So in his 2006 paper, Professor Žarnić presented a labeled natural deduction system for Kanger's theory rights. This is basically a translation of the title of the paper in Croatian, Jedan sustav obilježene prirodne dedukcije za Kangerovu teoriju prava. He proved this system to be sound and complete with respect to the semantics he introduced, and the semantics was done by connecting the semantics of action with the usual semantics of the ontic logic. The system is based upon an already existing account by Bašić-Nephew's Bigano system to construction of labeled deduction systems for normal model logics. And it's a hallmark of Professor Žarnić that it is carried out in a Fitch-proof format, because that was his regular choice of proof systems, always Fitch instead of Levin. Okay, this is obviously a highly technical paper, and it really presupposes some knowledge of basic logic and modal logic, although it does contain some useful introductions in the footnotes. On the bright side, since the paper is highly formal, many of its parts can be read even though it is written in fact in Croatian and you're not a Croatian-speaking person. However, I believe there is a typo in the proof 1.8. I think the reviewer didn't see it because it's just the roles from which the role is stated are stated wrong. So if you're careful in reading, you will see this typo. So let us now skip to Professor Žarnić's general study of normative systems, which, as I said at the beginning, that philosophy of law wasn't a central topic in his research, but it was an important aspect of his overall research of normative systems, especially since he was concerned with problems of revision of normative systems and influenced by AGM theory of belief revision. And this concern is very much visible in his paper, A Logical Typology of Normative Systems, again, a highly technical paper, which nonetheless bears much substantial issues. His aim in this paper is to develop a useful typology of normative systems described as sets of requirements in Broomian fashion and based upon their local and global properties. So in order to do this, he devised the meta language we already spoke about, and this language quantifies over normative sources, be they material or formal, normative agents, sentences, sets of sentences, and with all of this is introduced in order to express the syntax of normative theories, properties of normative sentences, properties of sets of normative sentences, and the relations between sets of normative sentences and the world, that is, the semantics. And he also introduced here for the first time the translation function you saw in the 2014 paper from standard deontic logic to the new meta language. So on the basis of von Rigt's later works, where deontic logic is used as a second order theory of normative systems. So this translation function is the key technical achievement which showed to be crucial in his later work, since it opened up the discussion space for the desirable properties of sets of requirements, so which leads us to the next stage of his work. So with the 2014 paper begins what I labeled here for this occasion, the mature phase of Professor Žarnić's work in philosophy of law. I think it's a mature phase because he took straight ahead the issue of desirable properties of normative systems, which were titled accordingly in the 2010 paper as Glimpses Beyond. It was a concluding chapter in his 2010 paper. Now in 2014, he really discusses these problems. So, of course, these problems have been already discussed in the literature, I believe dominantly in expressivist setting, and with respect to problems of resolution of conflicting norms within a normative system. Professor Žarnić's key insight in this paper, which was further and perfected in the next two papers, was to treat sets of norms as simple sets with no additional logical properties, in order to examine which properties defined in set theoretic terms are desirable properties of normative systems. And this examination was done by employing the translation functions from axioms of the ontic logic to set theoretic framework, which he first introduced in 2010. And the key to interpretation of the translation was the pragmatic perspective, in which the notion of the consistency of the normative system was shown to be a perfection property concerning the content of the norm system. And consistency of the norm set ought to be provided by the norm giver. The perfection property of deductive closure, on the other hand, was shown to be achieved in the activity of norm conforming and norm applying. That is, in the activities performed by norm recipients and norm appliers, that is, judges. Further extension of the paper from 2014 is his own paper, a social pragmatic view on the concept of normative consistency. Here he completed the translation function from the language of the Untitled logic to the language of such theoretical approach in order to establish further connection between the ontic postulates on the norm set and the other side of the counter set of the norms. So it's the counter set of the norms which is a novelty in this paper. Set theoretic modeling of norms with Professor Žarnić employs is von Richt's one. So he treats norm sets as simple sets with no logical properties assumed, and he introduces the set theoretic terms of filter, ideal, and weak ideal to model both the norm set, the set of explicitly stated norms, and the counter set, the set which we obtain by subtracting the norm set from the language, from its totality. So these set theoretic categories have their reading in classical propositional logic as consistent theory, or a consistent deductively closed set, because theory by definition is a deductively closed set. So that's the filter. And then there's the ideal as its complement. But here, in the ontic setting, these categories are employed to capture the concept of permission in a non-derivative sense. So, as I already stated, Professor Žarnić embraced many of late von Richt's views, one of them being that relationship between permission and absence of prohibition is not conceptual by nature, but normative. However, he doesn't address the more substantial discussion on what permission is. So he does adopt the view it's not a absence of prohibition, but he doesn't say what it is. His main thesis here is that consistency of the norm system is not a unique concept, because he distinguishes internal from the external consistency of the system, and further argues that there are two different dynamic second-order norms concerning consistency of the norm set. They are dynamic because they presuppose phases through which the norm system goes through. The norms are twofold, since they regard two different roles or actors in the norm regulating activity. The first norm concerns the norm giver. She ought to restore the classical consistency of the system by revising the content of the norm set or the counter set, but whether it is internal or external consistency which is at stake. The second norm concerns the norm recipient. She ought to preserve an inconsistent system by revising her logic, so that whatever consistency is found within the system, it does not imply its destruction, as one would expect will happen in the case in classical logic by the principle ex falso prohibit. So I believe these are very strong claims. And I also believe that Professor Žarnić had made quite an attempt to justify them. However, what strikes me the most about them, and as I believe not myself alone, is first the amount of responsibility which is placed upon the norm recipient in order to preserve the norm system, and secondly, the route which is suggested the norm recipient should take if inconsistency occurs, which, as Professor Žarnić suggests, it should consist in revising the logic of the system. So here it is important to state that Professor Žarnić uses the term of revising the logic as an umbrella term. So as he puts it, any change of any of the structural properties of the consequence relation in the language is, of course, a revision of its logic, however localized or small that a change might be. And I believe this is a direct response to a remark made by Jorge Rodriguez, who I believe shared similar concerns about these claims. Justification for claims Professor Žarnić makes is given on the basis of his first successful translation of the Deontic axioms to such theoretic terms, and second, it's the compliance of his idea that the norm recipient should restore the consistency of the system by revising her logic with dialectic Deontic logic of Grand Priest. So it is precisely Priest's dialectic non-classical logic with pre-truth values, true, false, and both true and false, which Professor Žarnić saw as logically suitable enough for his purposes, since, as he stresses, employment of this logic in unstable phases of the normative systems preserves coherence of the norm set and the perfection properties of both the norm set, the counter set, and their mutual relation. So, unstable phase of the normative system is, of course, a phase in which caused by inconsistency. And the language of Deontic logic, which was modified by Priest's dialectic logic, he gave it at the end of his paper. I think it really displayed his technical skills. His 2016 paper perfects the translation function even further to describe perfection properties of the relation between the norm set and the counter set. So it's external consistency, which is at issue here, and the gaplessness or completeness. And here Professor Žarnić showed that perfection properties come in pairs, one for obligations and another for permissions. So obligations and permissions have different logic, although both are characterized by the same axioms of the Deontic logic. So simply stated, we should translate differently the same axiom from the Deontic logic, one translation for obligations, another for permissions. And here he also argues in favor of the everything not forbidden is permitted as ceiling principle, not only as more reasonable as von Blick did, but he argued that it's also instrumentally rational, since the counterpart, the everything not permitted is forbidden, presupposes more than one equally acceptable state, and that is not rational willing, especially in von Blick's perspective. So I hope my talk gave you a correct overview of Professor Žarnić's work in philosophy law.